About 6 years ago, my friend Brian and I cut up a sequoia tree that was in his neighbor's backyard. And we spent several weekends, maybe even many weekends, cutting this sequoia into slabs. And I've had them air drying ever since. I've done a couple of things with this wood. I made the lawn chair that I did a couple of years ago was out of this same tree. Now we're also in need of a door over the pantry entrance. And what will work is to make a sliding barn door over that opening. So I thought it'd be nice to just make one of these slabs into a door for that opening. But what I'm finding is I have a set of slabs that are long enough, but not quite wide enough. I'm going to need 4 feet of width to cover the opening for the pantry. So what I think I'll do is combine 2 of these slabs into the door. So they're a little bit long, so I can cut some of the length off. And one thing that I've been wanting to try and do is to flatten these slabs on the CNC machine. By putting a big bit on the spindle, you can then have the machine go back and forth over the slab and flatten out or sort of surface one of the faces of the slab. It's sort of like having a really wide joiner. So I started a little bit timidly with it and took off just a little bit, and that seemed to work. So I did a second pass where I took off more, and that got the slab down to a nice flat surface. And I could start to see what the wood was going to look like. Now I had held this piece at the ends, and I hadn't flattened the ends, so they sort of stuck up a little bit. And once I got into this and started thinking about it, I was going to have to flip this over and do the other side. So I really needed the entire surface to be flattened. So I went back and took off the ends that I hadn't gotten to on the first pass. Then I could flip the piece over and make sure the table's clean so that it sits nice and flat with the table. Then in doing the second side, I held the piece with my little hold down tabs, and that worked, although I discovered in watching the time lapse that the piece moved a little bit. But it didn't move up and down, so the face of the slab was just fine. And this is the same process, just going over the whole piece with the spindle. And this is where the dust collection really helps, because you're making a lot of chips. So the first slab has been flattened. So this is sort of similar to running a smaller piece of wood through the joiner and then through the planer. First getting one side flat and then making the other side parallel to that first flat side. I had posted a picture of this on Instagram at about this point, and it was mentioned by several that it looks like bacon. So the second piece of wood, I did the same thing by cutting the length down. And I had the process down a little bit more at this point. I knew on the first side I should support the parts that aren't quite touching the table and sort of hold the piece at the average height, if that makes sense. And then instead of trying to hold it at the ends and not cutting the ends, actually screw it to the table but sink the screws in deep into the piece of wood so that the spindle can just go over the screws. And then setting the spindle at the lowest point of the piece of wood. I got this shot in my head where I wanted to get the view of the cut being made as it moved across the piece of wood. So what I did is I set up the CNC carriage on the gantry to take the picture each time it came over to the far side of the gantry. So I could sort of have the CNC do the stop motion for me. Now I didn't want to just cut these slabs up and put them together to make a wider piece of wood. We had talked about all kinds of different patterns or images or pictures or designs that I could do with this door. And after I had cleaned up the wood was so beautiful, I didn't want to cut some other design into it. So I wanted to do something that had to do with the patterning in the wood. And I didn't want to just make straight cuts into the wood either. So what I did is I photographed the first slab and I drew a line around the pith of that slab. As that slab is right at the center of the tree, so the center of the slab is sort of the weakest wood, and it was already starting to crack on its own. So I drew a line around the center, kind of following the grain, and cut that out of the big slab. Now, as this was getting towards the end, I could hear the wood cracking and starting to come apart along the cut. Like the cut was relieving a bunch of stress that was in the wood. At this point, I thought it was interesting, but I didn't think about it too much. And it ended up, as we'll see in a minute, being a little bit of an issue. So you can see the pith coming out. And I used the same screw holes that I used when I flattened the board. Now, because it kind of relieved a bunch of stress as it was being cut, the final pass in the router actually cut the piece in a slightly different place, so there was a little bit of a ledge on the cut. So I went back over it with the router to clean that up. And I was mostly thinking this was just going to be the issue, that the cut would need to get cleaned up a little bit. Not really thinking about how the two pieces were going to fit together. So the second piece, I took that same cut and I widened it up. And I then cut out that shape from the second piece, and that shape would fit into the first slab and sort of make the first slab wider. And in thinking about it now that it's done, I think the more conventional way to do it would have been to have based the shape on the inner piece and the grain within the inner piece instead of the grain of the outer piece. It's kind of the question of which piece is the figure and which piece is the ground. So in the end, this project, as we started to think about it, it would be some kind of image or some kind of object in the door. But in the end, the patterning in the door was really a result of the process of making the door. And I just let it be whatever it was going to be. I suppose that's just a long way of saying that it's abstract. So when I tried to fit the two pieces together, the side that didn't have so much figure to it went together just fine. But the side that I had made a bunch of deeper bumps or sort of deeper nubbins on and had more curve to it wasn't going together. So I tried sanding that side and it still wasn't going together. And what I began to realize is that if you were cutting up a big slab and putting it together, after you made your initial cut, you would go back and rejoint the cut to re-straighten the piece of wood after the stress had been relieved from the first big cut in the wood. So what I thought I would do is recut that shape into the side of the slab, which would act a little bit like rejointing the piece. It would recut that shape after the stress in the wood had been relieved. And in looking at it, the amount that was being taken off at the ends compared to the middle was different, meaning that the piece of wood had moved once it had been cut. And once I had sort of made that rejoint, the two pieces went together just fine. So I glued the three halves together. And every once in a while, I need my really long clamps. And I let that dry overnight. Now the door in the end was going to be 4 feet wide, so I just used a piece of 1/4-inch plywood to sort of make a template for the door. And I could sort of see really quickly where the door was in my big piece of wood. And I trimmed the width down, but not quite to the final width. So it's close to 4 feet wide, but not quite. More just to make it easier to move around. Now when I recut that shape into the wood, I was just a little bit off on the y-axis, I guess, which left some gaps on the little bumps that I had in that shape. So instead of recutting it like I could have done, because I also think moving that cut just a little bit into the piece of wood also changed the shapes of those bumps. So what I thought I would do is make some patches that go over those little openings in the seam. Now, CNC Router Parts gave me a copy of VCarve Pro, and I've been using that for 2D work. I've found that Fusion 360 is great for three-dimensional work, but it's a little bit cumbersome when you just want to cut out a shape. And the VCarve Pro is really good for that because it's just much, much simpler. Now this is where traditionally you do a butterfly, but I thought since I was sort of on the bacon theme, I would make little pieces of bacon that would fit over those holes. So they're bacon patches. So I cut the holes for those patches. Now I needed to make the actual patches that would fit into those holes. So I took one of the end pieces that I had cut off from the main slab and cut those down to something more manageable. And I've been thinking all along that the inside of the door I'm not going to worry about so much. And really I'm going to make the outside face the nice side. So I wasn't going to make these patches go all the way through. So I cut these pieces in half, and that way I could get twice as many out of the wood that I had. And I wanted to have the patch go across the seam between the heartwood and the sapwood, or the pink wood and the white wood, or within the bacon, the meat and the fat. Now I could glue those into place. And they went in pretty well. The first one I didn't set any difference between the positive and the negative as far as where the spindle would cut. And I had to sand it a little bit because it was tight. And I ended up with, I think, 1/100th of an inch difference to actually make these fit well. And I let those dry overnight. Then I could do the same process of surfacing the slab to cut both the 3 pieces of the slab flush, but also to cut the patches flush. And the last thing I wanted to do is to put a handle on the door. So I drew a shape that's kind of based on the little finger mold that I've done in that part of the house. I think I did this on the microwave stand and our little recycling drawer. And I wanted to round over the edge of this as it's the spot on the door that you're going to touch. I was going to do this with the router and just do it by hand, but I had my coordinates all set up and the bearing on the roundover bit that I had is 1/2 inch, which is the same size as the bit I used to cut the hole. So I tried putting the roundover bit into the CNC spindle and just having it do the same path, and it rounded over the handle. Now that the door is pretty close, I can work on the rail and the hardware that's going to hold it in place. So I unpacked the hardware that we got, which is basically a rail and then 2 brackets that hold the door. And the brackets will roll along the rail and let the door slide back and forth. Now what's tricky is the rail has holes pre-drilled in it at 16 inches apart. The bolts that hold the rail on the wall really have to go into the studs. You can't hold a door like this with a bolt going into plaster somewhere. So I went and first found by tapping and with my stud finder to find where the studs were, and then I went and drilled little holes to make sure there really were studs where I thought there were. After doing all this, I figured out I needed to cut about 6 inches off of the rail and that I would have to move one of the holes. So I cut the piece down and I drilled the one hole that I needed. I was lucky in that the rail was going to go over the header on the door. So for probably 2/3 of the length, I didn't need to worry so much about where the holes were because they were just going to go right into the header on the door. So I could drill the holes for the final bolts. And we could put the rail up. It helped a lot to have my wife hold the other end. So the rail sits on posts that the bolts go through, which sort of hold the rail away from the wall. So you can kind of see how that works here. So once everything's lined up and everything's level and it's all in the right place, it's just a matter of screwing it into place. That's the other tricky part, is that it had to be level and it had to be exactly the right height from the floor. So I actually did the rail first before I did the final cutting of the height of the door. So I could then measure exactly where I had it, and I could cut the door out of the slab that I had made. The next thing to do on the door is to add the brackets that'll hold it on the rail. And I wondered, before I cut the door out, should I have the CNC drill the holes for the brackets? And I thought about this, and I decided I sort of wanted the flexibility of doing it by hand to get them in the right place. But once I started doing this, I realized with the kind of the big grain of this wood, it was difficult getting the holes to stay in the right place as I drilled them by hand. So it might have been a little easier to have just done these with the CNC. But this worked in the end. Then we carried it in the house at this point. I wanted to make sure it was going to fit and see what it was going to look like and see if there's anything else that I needed to trim off of it or change or adjust. And it went in and it fit perfectly. I was amazed. It's always this stressful thing. You do all this work and is it really going to fit? But it was the right height and the width was good. The bolt that holds the wheel on the right side in this image was rubbing on the wall just a little bit. I think our wall isn't perfectly flat, but for the most part it would work perfectly. So what I wanted to do is take off a little bit of material for the baseboard to fit into on the bottom. So that's what this is. And this will let it hang a little bit closer to the wall. And there's a little fin that you screw to the floor, and that keeps the door from swinging in and out from the wall. So I had to cut a little slot on the bottom of the door. And I just ran the CNC machine sort of manually, driving the bit around, and cut that slot. To get a little bit more depth out of this bit, I had to take the bearing off. So I couldn't really do this with the handheld router. Then I sanded everything, and this wood's pretty soft, so it sanded really easily. In fact, it was a little bit grabby. It was a little bit hard to control the sander. Then I put finish on, and I just used polyurethane. I figured it needed to be a little bit durable. So I did one side, and I let that dry overnight. Then I flipped it over and did the other side. And I did 2 coats. Now I found in carrying this that it's actually easier for me to just carry it. So I had my wife sort of spot me as I brought it inside. This sequoia is really light, or it's really not very dense. So I think this looks heavier than it is. And I can put it in place. And the bolt doesn't drag anymore. Now this is the little fin that goes on the floor. So I sort of put that on the floor, and then I moved the door over to where it needed to be. Then I could put the fin in place. So that fin will ride in that slot that was cut. And I put a stop on one end. It'll have the door stop over the opening to the pantry, but it'll also keep the door from overrunning that little fin. So the fin will never be outside of the slot. Then on the other end of the rail, I didn't really have room for the stop, so the stop is the baseboard on the floor next to the door. But it seems to work. It keeps the pantry dark, and it looks nice. And I actually like how it simplifies that space. When you come in through that door and passing through to the kitchen, it feels a lot simpler and a lot clearer what you're supposed to do, if that makes sense. Thanks for watching.